to the gallery's first ever virtual gallery talk. I'm Shannon Egan. I'm the director of the Schmucker Art Gallery. I wish we were all able to be together in the same room this afternoon, but I suppose Zoom is the next best thing. But it is really, really wonderful to see so many of you all here amid so much anxiety and physical distancing and quarantining now. I'm just so grateful for this connection through our screens and for your willingness to spend a little bit of time this afternoon to learn something new about Mexican art and history. Before I turn things over to our amazing student curators, I just want to briefly walk you through the gallery space in case you haven't had the opportunity over the past 2 weeks to come into the gallery and to just mention a few upcoming virtual talks we have this semester. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Can everybody see this? Okay, so I'm very, very excited that we have on display Mexico and the People, curated by Carolyn Hauk and Joy Zanghi. But like I said, I just want to briefly mention the other exhibition we have on display, which is I Beseech You, Women, Art, Politics, and Power, which is an exhibition intended to celebrate and acknowledge women's artists' fight for social justice, peace, and environmental activism. So Jessica Houston is one of the artists we have on exhibit, and she will be giving an artist talk, again, virtually via Zoom on September 16th at 4 p.m. And then on October 21st at 6:30 p.m., Emily Francisco, who's class of 2014, Modern and Contemporary Art at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., will be giving a talk titled Re-Examining Narratives, Women Artists, and the National Gallery in 2020. But today, the exhibition we're focusing on, Mexico and the People, is the result of so much collaboration, hard work, and generosity over the past year or so. First, the 14 prints on display would not have been possible without the generosity of the Michael Burkner and Robin Wagner Art and Photography Acquisition Fund. This was a purchase we were able to make last year, and I want to just in the history department for her efforts in bringing this portfolio to our attention and her help in coordinating the purchase. I want to mention many, many thanks to Carolyn Sauter for always being so willing to collaborate with me on exhibitions, and to Sydney Gush and Leslie Castile for their tireless work at the Schmucker Art Gallery. And then finally, thanks to our co-sponsors, the Department of Spanish, Globalization Studies Program, and the Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies Program. And now I am just so delighted to introduce Carolyn and Joy to you, two seniors who have spent the past spring and summer researching, writing, editing this beautiful exhibition catalog. You can see it. When the gallery reopens after the all-student quarantine, Gettysburg College students, staff, and faculty are welcome to pick up a copy. It is also available as a PDF if you send me an email, segan@gettysburg.edu. We started planning the exhibition last fall, comfortably close and maskless up in special collections, not knowing that when the show would open, we would be in the midst of a pandemic. And so I'm very, very impressed with Carolyn and Joy's perseverance and positivity throughout the process of getting this exhibition together. I also want to thank Sydney Cacciapoli, also a Gettysburg College senior, who translated the labels into Spanish for us. Also, please note that this presentation is being recorded, so the recording will be available afterwards. The Q&A at the end will also be recorded, and so we'll have time for questions and answers after Joy and Carolyn give their presentations. For now, I ask that everyone remain muted, but you are welcome to ask questions in the chat box, and we'll address those questions after the talks. So I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn and Joy. Carolyn is a senior pursuing a double major in history and art history, and a double minor in public history and Italian. Last fall, she studied abroad in Rome, Italy, where she took courses in archaeology, Baroque art, and conservation. On campus, Carolyn is a Schmucker Art Gallery attendant and a writer, and the leader for Education House, the director of public relations for the college radio station, and the co-founder and vice president of the college's history club. So Carolyn stays busy. Joy is also busy. Joy Zanghi is a senior too, from Maine. She's worked in special collections as a student assistant and in the archives since 2018. And in that, and in her internship at the National Park Service in 2019, she's been able to really develop her passion for material culture. So I am going to have Carolyn and Joy turn their screens over to you now. So again, thank you all for being here. Feel free to chat, type questions in the chat, and enjoy.
Hello and thank you, Professor Egan, for that lovely introduction. I will now share my screen with everyone. Okay, so this is the Mexico and the People Art Gallery exhibit. And in order to gain a complete understanding and appreciation of these prints made by the Mexican artist collective known as the Taller de Grafica Popular, it is necessary to establish historical context, which I will do for you now. During the 20th century, Mexico experienced decades of political unrest and turmoil. The early 1900s were marked by the authoritarian rule of General Jose de la Cruz Porfirio Diaz. He served as president from 1876 to 1911, and he gained power through the use of illegitimate elections. During his oligarchical rule, known as the Porfiriato, Diaz weakened state and local identities in Mexico by encouraging foreign investment at the expense of Mexican natives. With this emphasis on modernization, land estates were easily attained by foreign investors. The lucrative mining industry served as one of the primary targets of international businesses. By creating many new laws, Diaz eroded Mexican control of mines and replaced it with American and British companies. In order to further encourage foreign investment, Diaz gave land rights and tax breaks to foreigners. By the first decade of the 1900s, companies from the United States had gained control over a majority of the Mexican mining industry. And that is just one of the many profitable industries that exploited the land and laborers during Diaz's rule. With land firmly under the control of the wealthy elite, working conditions deteriorated to the point of peonage and, in some cases, systemic enslavement of certain indigenous groups. Diaz used a system of cronyism to wrestle power out of the hands of the people in order to increase his political control over Mexico. This led to unrest and turmoil among the peasants and agrarian laborers as they were stripped of representation. Workers protested the changes through various strikes across the country. Tensions continued to grow in 1908 when President Diaz appeared open to the idea of democratic elections. He continued to deceive the people until the next election in 1910. That year, instead of choosing democracy, Diaz jailed his political opposition, Francisco Madero, and declared himself president once again. The spark needed for the Mexican Revolution had been struck. In 1911, the violence began and led to Diaz's resignation, with Madero taking the presidency. The subsequent years cast Mexico into a decade-long period of political instability and bloodshed. Competing factions vied for power as they demanded the implementation of their revolutionary goals. Despite frequent changes of presidents during the revolution, certain topics remained central to the revolutionaries. They advocated for land reform due to the fact that the Porfiriato had resulted in foreign influences purchasing land previously owned by Mexican peasants. In addition to land reform, many of the revolutionaries fought for decreased foreign influence, economic modernization, and a more hands-off government that reflected traditional structures prior to Diaz's presidency. The violence of the revolution fizzled out during the 1920s and came to a stop in 1934 with the presidency of Lázaro Cárdenas, who helped implement many of the reforms that had been fought for. The revolutionary ideals that echoed throughout the early years of the 1900s deeply influenced artists of the time as they sought to depict the newfound Mexican identity as well as to challenge ways of the past. The artists of the TGP, like many of their contemporaries, were deeply influenced by themes of the revolution, and this is evident in these lithographs. I'm now going to hand it over to Carolyn to discuss the art and artists in Mexico in the wake of the Mexican Revolution.
Thank you, Joy. Let me share my screen real quickly. Okay, so as we understand it, the Mexican Revolution was a cornerstone event that shaped the first half of the 20th century for Mexico. The revolutionary voices of Mexico's people that seemed to echo throughout time took root in the arts, and from there they emerged as this sort of collective force to bring about a new self-awareness and change, most importantly, for Mexico. Some of Mexico's most distinguished artists set out to challenge an overpowered government, to propagate social political advancement, and to reimagine a stronger unified national identity. So along with growing themes of class consciousness and internationalism, this new Mexicanidad identity was articulated in the work particularly representing the worker. And at the center of this art movement, we have the campesino, in English, a peasant. And with the campesino, we have issues of forced removal from land, ownership of domestic resources, and the disenfranchisement of agrarian groups and communities. This visual development of identity and the representation of workers' rights are reflected quite a lot in the efforts of different artist collectives in post-revolutionary Mexico, including the Liga de Escritores y Artistas Revolucionarios, otherwise known as LIR, and the Taller de Grafica Popular, the TGP. In the 1930s, Mexican art was deeply connected to social reform and activism in the aftermath of the Mexican Revolution. Even during the revolution, newspapers were inundated with political cartoons, making art a very important revolutionary tool. LIR was founded in 1933 by Leopoldo Mendez, Pablo Higgins, and Luis Arenal with the purpose of creating these satirical prints that were centered around the working class identity and furthermore, the condemnation of fascism. Lasting roughly only 4 years, the disunion of LIR led to the founding of the TGP by Mendez and O'Higgins. Upon its founding, the TGP published a declaration of principles to outline the collective's positions on art and Mexico's contemporaneous politics. The artists of the TGP firmly believed that it was meant to defend and enrich the national culture of Mexico, to reflect the social reality of the times in order to serve the people, and to contribute to the international fight against the spread of fascism. Right alongside prints of Mexico's workers, the TGP produced publications for anti-fascist press, backdrops for political rallies, and they showcased exhibitions about the terrors of Nazism. So during World War II, the TGP was entering into this period of growing sophistication and diversity. And so by 1945, its founders had found this new direction for the collective. After the war, the TGP entered into a phase of increased productivity. Its members would collaborate with leftist organizations in creating portfolios, prints, and other graphic projects. La Estampa Mexicana was particularly responsible for publishing their prints and portfolios that would appeal to foreign markets, visitors, galleries, and museums. These new productions of the TGP focused largely on anti-war imagery during the onslaught of the Cold War, but its artists never truly stopped creating prints to honor and promote the campesinos of agrarian Mexico. So in 1946, The TGB published the portfolio, Mexican People, which is the focus of our exhibition, for the Associated American Artists Gallery in New York. Included in this portfolio of lithographs are scenes of miners, brick makers, potters, farmers, lumber workers, vendors, all of which recall the efforts of the Mexican Revolution to bring about social reform for the campesinos and indigenous groups of Mexico. Accompanying descriptions of each lithograph describe and praise the work of the campesinos, but the work, as we can see in these prints, is often grueling and physically demanding. With this portfolio, the TGP found an opportunity to elevate these workers as defenders of cultural traditions and to honor them as the backbone of a modernizing nation. But we also have to look at the American front behind this portfolio. During this time, the American interest in Mexican art was at its peak. Artists such as Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo, and Jose Clemente Orozco captured the attention of American museums, galleries, and collectors all throughout the 1920s. And over time, US consumers began to demand the presence of modern Mexican art in American art markets. This growing interest in Mexican art coincided with the efforts of Reeves Leuenthal, the businessman and art director behind the Associated American Artists Gallery in New York, who was also encouraging art collecting primarily among the upper middle and middle classes, excuse me. So in order to democratize art, Leuenthal commissioned artists to create prints meant to be sold in a catalog. His gallery specialized in artists who painted pastoral scenes of America, such as Thomas Benton and Grant Wood. So the 12 lithographs in Mexican People seem to correspond nicely with the motifs of American farmers and workers in the AAA repertoire. Despite the overt communist politics of the TGP at the time appearing in a very anti-communist America, these lithographs appealed to American ideas of Mexico, which often romanticized peasant culture, poverty, ignorance, and superstition. Many American curators and gallerists worked to present an idyllic, imagined identity of Mexico, one that similarly emphasized the earnest work of the campesinos and the natural resources of Mexico's land. It seems that this portfolio was created at the intersection between the American ideas of an agrarian Mexico and the political agendas of the TGP, specifically aimed against the plight of Mexican workers. Nonetheless, here within these 12 lithographs, we find TGP's political activism, and we also find that revolutionary identity that focused on and uplifted the labors of Mexico's people. Now, Joy and I would like to talk a little bit about our curatorial experience and share some of these lithographs with you.
Thank you, Carolyn, for that background. I am once again going to share my screen. This is just a panorama I took of the exhibit, so you can almost feel like you're there, which I wish everyone could be, but I understand that you can't right now. Now that you have a greater understanding of the background behind the history of the Mexican Revolution and the TGP, I'd like to share a little bit about my curatorial process and walk you through two of my favorite pieces. I was informed about the opportunity to curate this exhibit, I think in November of last year. As a history and Spanish Latin American studies double major, I was really excited to work with these lithographs. This is my first exhibit I've ever curated. While I've had experience working in the archives here at Gettysburg and interning with a curator at the National Park Service, it was a joy to be able to curate this exhibit with the independence we were given. It was also my first time dipping my toes into art history. In fact, the first research I did was to Google, what is a lithograph? Over the course of the past few months, I'm very proud to say I have finally learned what a lithograph is. It's a form of printmaking using oil and water, as well as much more. Due to the pandemic, my spring semester was spent at home, meaning the bulk of this project was done remotely. As you can tell, the remote work has continued as I'm now giving this talk from my room in Gettysburg. To begin, Carolyn and I divided up the prints by each picking 6 we wanted to focus on. For some time, these 6 prints served as my company during the pandemic. After all these months of remote research, seeing the lithographs hung on the gallery wall next to my work was a powerful moment, and it was even more exciting than I imagined it would be. I am very grateful to have had this opportunity thanks to Professor Egan and Professor Summer. While I could talk about all of the 6 prints I researched individually, I will only dive into 2 of my favorites for today. The print you are now looking at is called El Obrero de Mina de Plata, also known as Silver Mine Worker. It was made by Francisco Mora in 1946. I'm very fond of this lithograph because of how striking it is. Here we see the skeletal figure of a miner moving towards the audience into the increasing darkness of the tunnel. Punching forward, the man is clad in nothing more than shorts, sandals, and a helmet, and he holds only a flashlight for guidance despite the dangers of mining. Although he moves towards the audience, his eyes look past us into the depth of the mine, which gives the piece a voyeuristic feeling. From the defined shape of his ribcage to his claw-like right hand and his thin arms, the sunken features of the miner, coupled with his averted gaze, establish a sense of guilt among the audience, as if we shouldn't be looking at him. With only a small part of the scene lit by the glow of his flashlight, the darkness seems to close in on the miner as he maneuvers the clearly uncomfortable space. The figures in the distance, working outside of the tunnel, add to the isolation of the mine worker, and the outside light drastically contrasts with the darkness that surrounds him. As I mentioned, in my background of the Mexican Revolution, the mining industry was deeply impacted by the Porfiriato, and in the early 1900s, the mines were mostly owned by foreign companies. With many of the mines being owned by outsiders, the racial prejudice and colorism against darker-skinned Mexicans were widespread in the industry. While lighter-skinned workers from North America and Europe were able to work in more skilled positions, Mexicans were required to do the most dangerous jobs, such as digging for and hauling for ore in the mines. Even if the Mexican and foreign laborers shared the same position, foreigners would earn wages double that of a Mexican worker solely due to their race. Although this print was made 35 years after the start of the Mexican Revolution, the gaunt appearance of the silver miner in Mora's work serves as a reminder of the unjust conditions that Mexican campesinos were subjected to during the 20th century. Overall, I think this piece really exemplifies the works of this portfolio. Not only is it incredibly powerful to look at, but it also focuses on the laborer and hints at the injustices that many Mexican people fought against throughout the revolution. This second print I would like to share with you, Las Familias Huicholas, or The Ritual of the Huichol Indian Tribe, was made by Angel Bracho also in 1946. As such a complex image, it is a pleasure to dive into the little details of this lithograph. To begin, this print portrays a man bearing various tools and weapons as he journeys through a mountainous area. He's followed by a woman with a baby swaddled on her back. Living in the Sierra Madre mountain range, the Huichol people existed in an environment characterized by a rugged land of steep canyons, such as the one Bracho depicts here. The figures in Bracho's composition are most likely making the sacred pilgrimage of the Huichol. These pilgrimages were used to establish a deeper connection with their land and ancestors. Such pilgrimages also emphasized a sense of place in their environment. The dreamlike setting of this print emphasizes the divine nature of Las Familias Huicholas and draws on surrealism, type of art made popular by Mexican artists Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera. As the man journeys through the fantastical terrain, his toe extends beyond the frame of the print, transcending his plane of existence as he would during a sacred pilgrimage. The subject is literally depicted as he transitions from one realm to another, merging the space of the audience with the setting of the print. In addition to the deeply spiritual connection of the pilgrimage of the Huichols, the ritual was also tied to land rotation in order to maximize crop production. Founded on the belief that they could take care of all life by healing the earth, the relationship between Huichols and the land was critical to their way of life. Bracho's complicated print honors the Huichol connection to the land. These two prints are just examples of the many great works of the TGP. I've truly enjoyed being a part of this exhibit, and thank you for listening to my talk. Now here's Carolyn to talk about another piece.
Thank you. Let me share my screen one more time. Okay, so as you can imagine, the curatorial process for this year was different, unconventional. Back in January, I had the opportunity to look at these prints in person for the first time ever. And flash forward to August, I'm seeing them in person for the second time ever. And it's right as they're about to be hung up on the walls of the gallery. I was in the thick of my research before we hit spring break. And by that point, we'd even settled on a title for the show. But within that extended spring break period, I became so worried over whether I would have access to that research as it sat on my desk in Gettysburg, or if I had to press forward without my collected books and improvise. So quite literally, it was a race to get back to campus, to throw all my research into the car before anything else, and head back home. Over the remainder of the semester and throughout the summer, Joy and I curated this show from our homes, exchanging our ideas and research largely over email and Zoom. But after a summer of hard work, I am so pleased to see our research and ideas up on the walls of Schmucker Art Gallery. After some preliminary research in January, I had thought perhaps the show would focus solely on the Mexican culture of the early 20th century. But as I dug deeper into the history of the TGP and the Mexican Revolution, I realized there are many more facets and themes to be gleaned from these prints. And I wanted to make sure that these lithographs were able to communicate these ideas to everyone as well. Alongside the larger theme of identity in post-revolutionary Mexico, I also wanted to talk about the female history of the revolution, the continued exploitation of campesinos during this time, the larger politics and messages of the TGP, American interest in Mexican art, the theme of modernization and conversely tradition. I also wanted to look at each artist individually and how they found their way to the TGP, both politically and artistically. So, as the title of the show suggests, we're dealing with the people, the campesinos and workers throughout Mexico, the artists of the TGP, the revolutionaries, and at times the American people as well. These ideas and themes are further dissected in the catalog essays for each print. So I will now shift towards my discussion on a specific lithograph that I researched for this exhibition. We may all be familiar with this print at this point, as we used it to advertise this show. This is Pablo Higgins' El Mercado, the market in English. And in the very center of this composition, we have our subject. This is a female vendor displaying various foods and wares on a busy street in the Catlett market. She gazes attentively at her foodstuffs, dismissing us, the viewer, as one of the many passersby she might encounter on a daily basis. Other sellers attend a nearby stand in this bustling and crowded part of the market. The thick, fluid lines that outline each figure are very characteristic of Pablo Higgins' work, which was influenced by French lithographer and anti-monarchist Honoré Daumier. As one of the only two prints in the Mexican people portfolio depicted with vivid colors, O'Higgins emulates the vibrancy and lively commotion of the marketplace. This vibrancy attracted foreign artists, tourists like Englishman Thomas Brocklehurst, who wrote on his trip to the markets in the 19th century, quote, "Indian women stretched on mats indolently watch their wares, fruits of 50 kinds, very few of them worth eating. Girls with great coops of chickens on their backs and a dozen live fowls hanging from their heads downwards from their waist belts jostle past you," end quote. This kind of writing romanticized Mexico's marketplaces and attracted a lot of foreign investments. It also further perpetuated long-held European ideas of an exotic Mexican culture that was forged from Aztec and Spanish civilizations. More importantly, Brocklehurst overlooked the female vendors' entrepreneurial efforts and relegated them largely to the scenery of Mexican streets. Despite the rapid modernization and industrialization of Mexico during the turn of the century, public markets continued to buttress urban economies in cities. These female vendors often sold grains, meats, vegetables, fruits, and other wares from street corners, from plazas, public gardens, outside of public buildings, and door entryways. These women were often unmarried, or they were widowed, or they were the sole providers for their families. The work hardly provided substantial means to get by, but female vendors were some of Mexico's shrewdest businesswomen. They entered into the public sphere as saleswomen, whereas most women were relegated to the home. In fact, these women often wrote petitions to city halls to plead for reduced taxes, and these evidenced some of the first political actions that really set the precedent for women-led protests in the first half of the 20th century. Between 1919 and 1953, feminist groups such as the Mexican Feminist Council and the United Front for Women's Rights were concerned with the social, political, and economic advancement of women. The latter of these two groups was primarily focused on and including Indigenous women in the campaign for equal rights in the workplace, property, ownership, and education. Toward the end of the Mexican Revolution, women initiated campaigns to insert themselves into the economic, political, and social spheres that were once dominated by men. Women gradually gained legal equality and were eventually granted suffrage in 1953 under President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines. In the early 20th century, women found ways to upheave gendered social standards and take up jobs previously held by men. Perhaps these efforts began with the women in the markets who found ways to establish their own independence through political action. Though Higgins' lithograph of a vendor in a lively Mexican market may have appealed to foreigners such as Brocklehurst, it is more likely a celebration of women who continue to support growing urban economies and established a foothold in economic and political representation. Perhaps the woman depicted in this lithograph was one of the many vendors who petitioned for reduced taxes. Perhaps she too has a family that relies on her entrepreneurial savviness at the markets. Though the piecing together this exhibition occurred largely off campus, it was truly gratifying to see it all come together over the summer. And it was—
These original lithographs are in the library.
It was doubly rewarding to actually be able to see the prints and their labels on the walls in person after all the work was complete. So I want to thank our supervisor, Professor Shannon Egan, Sydney Gush, and Leslie Castile for making this exhibit possible despite these strange circumstances. And although we gather in the gallery space under normal circumstances, I'm incredibly thankful to have all of you join us over Zoom today. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you guys. That was wonderful. That's really exciting. So, so we do have time. It's only about 4:30. So I would like to open it up to questions. So please feel free to share your video, unmute yourself if you are not comfortable being recorded. Feel free to, here's a question in the chat box. And I'm going to say it out loud. I wondered if all of the artists in the portfolio are men, were any of them women artists, or is this men drawing their idea of women? Great question.
So all of the artists in this portfolio are men. If you look through our virtual exhibition or in person, once the student-wide quarantine is lifted, you'll notice that in the background of a lot of these prints, we have women who are working right alongside men. And only in 2 instances, including El Mercado and Trabajando con Esto, do we see a woman as the subject of these prints.
And I also want to mention too that women did participate in the TGP, and one of the prints that we have in the other exhibition, I Beseech You, an African-American artist named Elizabeth Catlett traveled to Mexico City, was a member of the TGP, worked in that workshop in 1946, and married one of the artists, Francisco Mora, who's represented in the portfolio in the Mexico and the People exhibit. So women did participate in the TGP, from my understanding, but were not included in this portfolio. Any other questions?
It's not really a question, it's just like a commentary. So my mother is actually from Nayarit, and she grew up with the indigenous group Huichol. So I just wanted to thank you guys for actually showing that, because a lot of people know about the indigenous groups in Mexico. And I think it's really important that more people get to know about the various aspects and how each tribe is different from the other ones.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. It's wonderful. And following up on that comment, if you could maybe talk about, again, the research process, because I was very impressed with starting with the print, the various directions that the research took you, including, as we just heard, the indigenous people.
Yeah, so I took a class on the Mexican Revolution with Professor Summer, and she's the one who told me about this opportunity. So I sort of came looking at these lithographs from a more historical background, specifically having learned about the early 20th century in Mexico. And then also, as I continued to look at the subjects of each work, I feel like it's impossible to ignore the indigenous impact on Mexican culture and identity, especially post-revolution, when this idea of Mexicanidad was sort of increasing. And a lot of it did look back to indigenous tribes throughout Mexico. And I, as a Latin American in history, like a Latin American studies major as well, I think it's impossible to ignore the indigenous communities that permeate through Latin America. So it was personally something that I really liked looking into, and that's why that one print that I showed you, Las Familias Huicholas, was one of my favorite prints, just because I think it's really important that the artists were showing indigenous people and giving them a type of recognition, and I hope more of that is done in academia as well.
There's another great question in the chat box that I'm going to read out loud and hope you both will answer. Did either of you have an aha moment in your research where you either learned something really surprising or you connected with something from a previous class? Joy, you kind of answered this a bit already, but we'd love to hear from both of you.
Sure. I had to start from scratch. I have not taken a class at Gettysburg College specifically about the Mexican Revolution. So a lot of my research was pulling information from different facets from the revolution to traditions in Mexican culture, and furthermore, understanding how that culture was perceived by American audiences. So there was a lot of different aha moments and connections going on for me.
Okay, so anything else? Anybody else? Okay, so I think unless y'all have any other last minute questions or comments, I just want to mention lots of praise in the chat box for you all. So well done. I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that we can open our doors again after the all quarantine has lifted. But I do want to give special thanks to those of you who have joined us, friends and family from far away. It's wonderful to kind of recognize some of the names in the boxes. And like I said in the beginning, I just feel very, very fortunate to have this connection when it's a time of distancing. So once again, many thanks to Joy and to Carolyn. Again, there's a question. Couple more questions that are coming in. How does this impact what you might want to do next? That's a great question.
I know I'm, with my work in special collections, I've been really influenced by that, and definitely love material culture. And I also really like what I've been learning in my Latin American studies and Spanish classes. And I'd like to couple the idea of decolonization somehow with my love for material culture, preferably through archives in some way. I would like to see those two things come together. Hopefully I can work on that in my future, but I think it's
Great. How about you, Carolyn? What's next?
So I love connecting history and art history as much as I can in all of my studies. So this was such a unique and exciting opportunity to be able to combine the two. And I'm sure that in the future, hopefully by the time I graduate this pandemic will have cooled down a bit, I'm considering pursuing graduate school.
Good. I'm going to answer this one quick question. The exhibition will be open through October 31st. Right now, the gallery, once the quarantine lifts, the gallery is only open to current Gettysburg College students, faculty, and staff. If that changes, we'll let everyone know. And another great question down here, when you have put the time and effort into building this beautiful exhibition, what is the main message you wanted to show the students?
I definitely want this exhibition to be as much of a learning opportunity for everyone who sees it as it has been for me, and to furthermore connect with the art on any sort of level.
Great. And another question regarding the print, Joy, that you showed, Las Familias Huicholas. Do you mind talking about the transition from one realm to another, kind of explaining its significance? And this person thought it was a very interesting perspective.
Yeah, so I can share my screen again if you want to actually look at the print while I'm
that would be helpful. That'd be great to show the print again.
Here. So if you look in the bottom of the screen, you can see just the big toe of the man in the front extends past the border of the image itself, or like the lithograph. And I thought that was very interesting because this was like a sacred act of connecting to nature and like with ancestors of the Huichol people. So I think it's interesting that not only is the subject transcending his own space in like his art world, but he's also transcending into our space by stepping out of the picture towards us, in a sense, because it looks like he will start walking off of the print and into our own world. So I feel like it shows the transcension of, yes, he's transcending a world in his own like spirituality, but also entering our world as well as the audience.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question from Professor Summer. Do either of you plan to travel in Mexico post-COVID?
I would love to. That would be very nice. I feel like I've studied so much about it that I would be very rewarding to finally go.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely as soon as it's safe to travel again.
Yeah. One more question from Robin Wagner. You may have actually said this and I just missed it, but were the artists actually indigenous people, or were they upper class Mexicans painting indigenous topics? Or can you kind of characterize maybe the class of people who are the artists who are involved in the TGP?
Sure, I know from the artists that I was researching that a lot of them weren't coming from this upper class. A lot of them were also experiencing or witnessing some of the continued exploitation of the Mexican working class.
Yeah, and the artist who made Familias Huicholas, he was not indigenous, but he focused a lot on depicting indigenous people, and he had a whole portfolio that happened, I think, a year prior to this portfolio that focused specifically like only on indigenous people and their cultures and rituals. So I don't like, while he wasn't indigenous, I do think he was trying to give them more of a platform, and it wasn't from like an upper class kind of standpoint either. It was more like the people was their big central unifying thing.
And one of the artists too, Pablo Higgins, right, that Carolyn, that you studied, he was American, born in Utah, right? And his name was Paul, and then changed it to Pablo. Yeah.
The 1960s that he actually received Mexican citizenship. So.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I guess that is, like I said, feel free to keep chiming in. We'll kind of hang back for a couple of minutes if you have any other comments or questions. But again, thank you. Thank you all for being here, for spending a little bit more screen time with us today. And yeah, come to the gallery when you can, if you can. And please tune back in on September 16th. It should be, I think, the same Zoom link, but for another presentation by artist Jessica Houston. So thank you all. Take care. Stay well.